That night, I was home alone, as had become routine ever since my parents started traveling more frequently. Our house, isolated, stood on the edge of a large lake, with a vast garden that stretched all the way to the water's edge. On the other side of the lake was a small, dimly lit park, a place that seemed deserted even during the day. At night, the park became a blur of darkness, something that always brought me a sense of unease. I was 21 years old and used to being alone, but that night felt different. I sat in the sunroom, my favorite spot in the house, surrounded by large glass windows offering a panoramic view of the garden and the lake. The night was warm, but a cool breeze softly blew through the open windows, bringing a feeling of unrest. The air felt heavy, as if something was wrong, but what could it be? My attention was divided between the sound of the television and the faint rustling of leaves outside. I was trying to ignore the growing sensation that something was about to happen. Then I heard it for the first time. A strange noise coming from the lake, a sound of water stirring, as if something large was disturbing the surface. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a bird or a large fish, but the sound was too strong, as if something heavier was moving. I turned off the television, now completely focused on the noise outside. My heart began to race, and a cold sensation crept up my spine. Then I heard what seemed like a voice, a low, deep murmur that blended with the sound of the waves. I stared at the lake, trying to see through the darkness beyond the faint light of the outdoor lamps. The voice continued, a strange and unsettling humming, like someone talking to themselves. I stood up slowly, trying to control the panic rising within me. I walked toward the glass door that led to the deck, hesitating before opening it and turning on the outdoor lights. The light illuminated a small part of the garden and the lake, but the rest remained submerged in darkness. The sound suddenly stopped. The voice vanished along with the noise of the waves, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I was watching. I quickly went back inside, locking the glass door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and a chill began to overtake my body. I grabbed my phone and sent a message to my brother, who was out of town, but he didn't reply right away. I sat on the couch, trying to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. Maybe it was just the wind, or a wild animal venturing into the lake. But logic didn't soothe the fear growing inside me. The house, once a refuge, now felt oppressive. The large windows that once made me feel free now made me feel exposed. The sense that something was watching me was almost tangible. I stayed there for a few minutes, completely still, trying to push away the shadows dancing in my mind. Then I heard a new sound. Footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible, on the wooden deck just outside the living room. I held my breath for a second, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was impossible to deny. Someone was walking around the house. I turned off the TV, plunging the room into complete darkness. My body stiffened, the panic rising. The sound of the footsteps drew closer, slower, as if the person outside was moving cautiously. Then, the silence was broken abruptly. Heavy breathing, almost animalistic, coming from outside one of the windows. I crouched down on the floor next to the couch, trying not to make any movement. The sound of the breathing continued, slow and deep, as if someone was there, waiting for me to react. My heart was beating so loudly, I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. Then, a low, rough voice whispered through the window, "I see you." Those words pierced my mind like sharp knives. I felt the blood freeze in my veins, and for a moment, I was completely paralyzed. Whoever it was, they were right there, outside, watching me. Without thinking much, I shouted, "Paul, is that you?" Paul was our neighbor's name, and the hope that this was just a stupid prank was the only thing keeping me on my feet at that moment. The silence that followed was terrifying. No response, only the muffled sound of my own breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps moving away, heading toward the garden. I stayed on the floor for several more minutes, waiting for the panic to subside, but the sense of danger never left. I slowly got up, my legs trembling, and went to check if all the doors were locked. They were, but that didn't reassure me. I grabbed my phone again and sent more frantic messages to my family, telling them what had just happened. My father, always practical, suggested that I turn on the outdoor lights and take a look outside. I hesitated, but I knew I had to do something. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my only defense, and approached the glass door. I took a deep breath and with a trembling hand turned on the deck lights. What I saw next made my heart stop for a moment. Wet footprints scattered across the wooden deck. Small puddles of water marked the floor, and the prints were of bare feet. I followed the trail of footprints with my eyes until, in the corner of the porch, I saw something that made me lose my breath. There was someone there, peering over the edge of the deck, only the head and eyes visible. Our gazes met for a split second before the figure disappeared into the darkness. Panic took over me. I ran back inside and locked the door with all my strength. I called the police immediately, my hands shaking so much I could barely dial the number. I waited, locked inside the house, each minute feeling like an eternity. When the police finally arrived, they searched the entire property, but found nothing. They asked me if I had any enemies, anyone who might be stalking me. I denied it, my mind spinning, searching for any logical explanation. They tried to reassure me, saying it was probably someone from outside, maybe a homeless person or a teenager playing a prank. But I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something more sinister about all of it, a feeling that I was being hunted. When the police left, I locked all the doors and windows again. That night, I decided I wouldn't sleep. However, sleep eventually overcame me, and when I woke up, the sun was already shining. For a brief moment, the daylight brought relief, but then I remembered the wet footprints. I quickly got up and went to the deck. The footprints were still there, dried by the wind, but the memory of that figure watching me remained vivid. I wasn't safe. In the days that followed, I tried to resume my routine, but the feeling of being watched never left. During the day, everything seemed normal, but at night, the house became a place of fear. I checked the locks several times before going to bed, but that didn't bring the peace I sought. My family began to notice my change in behavior. I was more withdrawn, more paranoid. The police made a few more patrols around the area, but they never found anything. The neighbors didn't report any suspicious activity, and soon the case was forgotten. But for me, The feeling that something was wrong never went away. The nights were a constant nightmare. I isolated myself more and more, avoiding leaving the house, especially at night. One day, I decided I needed answers. I left the house in the late afternoon and went to the park on the other side of the lake. It was always an empty place, but now it seemed even more desolate. As I walked along the trail, I felt an invisible presence watching me. My steps were accompanied by the crackling of leaves, as if someone was following me. I followed the trail to a small clearing in the middle of the woods. In the center, there was an old, worn bench. Deep scratch marks covered the wooden boards, as if someone had tried to destroy it. I looked around, feeling the dread grow. The sound of rustling leaves made my heart race. It was clear that I wasn't alone. Panic took over, and I decided it was time to go back. I hurried along the trail, the sound of footsteps following me getting closer. When I finally reached the edge of the lake, I looked back, but there was no one. I ran to my house, locking the door behind me, the terror now gripping every fiber of my being. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fear that it would return was unbearable. I knew that this was far from over. In the following days, fear became a constant companion. During the day, I kept to my routine, but always with the sensation that something was lurking in the distance, invisible to the eyes, but present in the air. And at night, the house turned into an oppressive place, where every shadow seemed to hide an imminent danger. Sleeping had become impossible. The slightest noise, a creak in the wood, the rustling of the trees outside, made my heart race. I started to notice small details that hadn't been there before. Footprints in the grass dampened by the morning dew, strange marks on the windows, as if someone had run their fingers along the glass. I reviewed the security cameras that my father had installed, but the footage always showed the same thing: the dark night, the empty garden, and the constant feeling that the danger was just beyond the reach of the lenses. My paranoia reached a point where I started sleeping with a knife by my bed. I knew it wouldn't be enough to protect me from something, or someone, that always seemed one step ahead, but it was the only thing that made me feel even slightly secure. I needed answers, but with every new clue that emerged, the feeling that I was being dragged into something much bigger than I could imagine grew stronger. My family remained worried, but they thought I was exaggerating, that my isolation was affecting me mentally. "Maybe you need some time away from home," my mother suggested during one of our calls. But the idea of leaving and letting whatever it was take control of my space terrified me even more. Then something happened that solidified the terror in my mind. It was a typical early morning, the wind blowing gently outside, and I was once again sitting in the sunroom, trying to stay awake. My phone was beside me, and I was constantly checking the cameras through the app. That's when I heard a sound I would never forget, a low, guttural laugh coming from somewhere in the garden. I stood up, the hairs on my arms immediately standing on end. I ran to the window and looked outside, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the small area illuminated by the house lights. The laughter continued, and my heart raced. The knife in my trembling hand felt ridiculous in the face of what I was up against. My mouth went dry as I scanned for any movement between the trees or near the lake. But there was nothing, just that horrible sound, as if something was mocking me. When the laughter finally stopped, I was consumed by an even more terrifying silence. That empty, expectant silence, as if something was about to happen. Then I saw it. Something moving in the shadow of the trees, a tall, slender figure. Its eyes glowed, reflecting the light from the house for a brief second before disappearing into the shadows. My muscles froze. There was no longer any denying that someone, or something, was stalking me, waiting for the right moment to act. I called the police again, but when they arrived, as before, they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of intrusion. They looked at me with disbelief, perhaps thinking I was losing my mind. But I knew I was being hunted. The next morning, I decided I needed to investigate further. There was something about this story I didn't fully understand. I went back to the library, this time focused on uncovering more about the events that had occurred around the lake decades ago. I spent hours sifting through old newspapers, police reports, and local legends. That's when I found a crucial detail. A man known only as the guardian of the lake, who had disappeared years ago. They said he had been seen watching over the area for entire nights, warning about a dark presence that inhabited the waters. The locals considered him crazy until the day he simply vanished. After his disappearance, reports of mysterious footprints and strange deaths in the area began to surface. I returned home with a growing sense of dread. What was in that lake? And why did I seem to be the target now? I knew I couldn't stay there, but something kept me trapped, as if leaving the house would let the enemy win. I stayed up all night again, but this time I made a decision. I would confront whatever it was. I couldn't bear that invisible presence haunting my house and my life any longer. I waited until midnight when the darkness was at its peak. I grabbed a flashlight, the knife I kept by my side, and went out into the garden. The night was eerily silent, the lake completely still. I walked to the shore, trying to stay calm, but I could feel something watching me from the darkness of the park on the other side. The cold wind cut my face, and each step seemed to take me deeper into a macabre game whose rules I didn't understand. And then, suddenly, the sound returned. The water began to stir, and I heard that same distant humming coming from the middle of the lake. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hands. The voice was deep, guttural, and seemed to come from something that shouldn't exist. The sounds surrounded me, and for a moment, the water of the lake seemed to move unnaturally, forming waves that crashed against the stones on the shore. I was overtaken by a primal fear. Something was about to emerge from those waters. A silhouette began to take shape in the middle of the lake, and I knew, without a doubt, that I was looking at what had haunted me for the past few weeks. The figure started moving toward me, slow and relentless, and its eyes, the same eyes that had watched me from the deck, gleamed under the faint beam of the flashlight. I ran. I ran like I had never run before, feeling the presence behind me, getting closer with every step. The shadows of the trees in the garden seemed to move, as if they were alive, trying to trap me. When I finally reached the door of the house, locking it with all my strength, I could hear the sound of something large and heavy dragging itself across the grass. That thing was there right outside, but I knew the door wouldn't hold it forever. The next few days were a blur. My mind was on the verge of collapse. I avoided leaving the house, kept the curtains closed, and the lights on at all times. My parents called, worried, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening. Every minute felt like torture, and the silence of the night was almost unbearable. Then the final straw came. I was in my bedroom, trying to force myself to sleep, when I heard the sound. A soft crack coming from the window. Terror gripped me, and when I turned, I saw a hand. A pale, long-fingered, skeletal hand pressed against the glass. It was there. I froze. The sight of that hand pressed against the glass made my heart stop for a moment. It was there, so close, that I could see the pale skin, almost translucent, stretched over the thin, long bones. The fingers moved slowly, scratching the glass with a sound that echoed in my head like a muffled scream. It was real. That thing was there, outside my window, and the fear I felt was beyond words. For a second, I considered screaming, but who would hear? My house, isolated by the garden and the lake, felt like a prison. No one would come to help in time. Trembling, my body refused to move. My eyes stayed fixed on the hand, hoping it would disappear, that this was a horrible nightmare from which I could wake up. But the nightmare didn't end. Slowly, the hand began to slide down the glass, scratching it harder, the sound becoming unbearable. I felt panic completely overtake me. With a sudden movement, I got up from the bed, running to the hallway and locking the bedroom door behind me. I knew it wouldn't be enough, but my primal instinct for survival forced me to do something, anything. The sound continued, now louder, as if the thing was trying to open the window, forcing its way in. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely grab my phone. I called the police again, nearly crying in despair. The response was the same as always. They would send a patrol car, but I knew with all certainty that the police would arrive too late. That thing was determined to get me. I could feel the growing pressure in the air, as if the very house was being engulfed by an invisible, dense, oppressive force. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, reached an unbearable peak. The house, which had once given me comfort, was now a place of pure terror. Every corner seemed to hide moving shadows. Every sound was amplified by the oppressive silence of the night. And the sound at the window, it didn't stop. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out. I had to run. But run where? That thing was outside, in the garden, waiting. I was a trapped prey. I went to the kitchen and grabbed the sharpest knife I could find. It was a pathetic defense, but it was all I had. The noise at the window suddenly stopped, and a deadly silence took over the house. My breathing was fast and erratic, the fear turning every second into an eternity. Something told me the worst was about to happen. And then I heard it, footsteps, slowly coming from outside, as if someone was walking around the house, circling, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The garden lights, which always illuminated the perimeter of the house, began to flicker. One by one, the posts went out, plunging everything into complete darkness. I was alone, and the fear had now turned into absolute despair. I decided I couldn't just stand there. My legs, trembling, carried me to the front door. With the knife in one hand and my phone in the other, I prepared to run. The idea of facing whatever was outside seemed suicidal, but the alternative, staying inside that dark house, alone, waiting for the thing that had been tormenting me for weeks, was even worse. I opened the door abruptly and ran outside. The night air was cold, cutting, very different from the stifling heat that usually dominated the summer. My bare feet sank into the wet grass as I ran toward the garden, the flashlight from my phone weakly illuminating my path. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. I had to reach the road, maybe a neighbor's house. Then I heard it again. That voice, the same voice that had hummed from the middle of the lake weeks ago. It was deep, guttural, but there was something different now. It sounded closer, more threatening, as if it were right behind me. My body froze for a moment, unable to move, but something forced me to keep running. I knew that if I stopped, it would be the end. I reached the edge of the lake, panting, my body exhausted. The water, once calm, was now strangely agitated, as if something was moving in the depths. I felt a presence there, in the darkness, watching me, waiting for me to come closer. I looked around, searching for an escape, but everything seemed closed, as if the world around me was shrinking. Then, from the water, something emerged. The same figure I had seen before, tall, skeletal, with eyes that seemed to suck all the light around them. It emerged slowly, as if it were part of the very darkness of the lake, moving with a calculated slowness. The terror I felt at that moment was overwhelming. I was paralyzed, the knife useless in my trembling hands. The figure didn't say anything, it just watched me, its eyes fixed on me. Its long, thin arms began to extend toward me, and that's when I knew there was no more escape. That thing, whatever it was, had been hunting me from the beginning. And now, it had finally caught up with me. I tried to run, but my feet were stuck in the mud of the lake's edge. Every movement seemed to sink me deeper, while the figure came closer and closer. The air around me felt heavier, almost unbreathable, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to keep me there. The feeling that the end was near consumed me. When that thing was only a few meters from me, something unexpected happened. The sky, which had been clear, lit up with sudden lightning, and the sound of thunder echoed across the lake. The figure stopped for a brief second, and in that moment of hesitation, I managed to free myself from the mud and run as fast as I could toward the forest. I didn't look back, but I could feel it still following me, its slow but relentless steps. I ran blindly through the woods, the branches scratching my face and arms, but fear drove me forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights ahead. It was the road. With the last of my strength, I ran until I reached the asphalt, and there, I fell to my knees, panting, as the headlights of a car approached. The police arrived soon after, finding me in a state of shock, dirty, scratched, and unable to explain exactly what had happened. They took me to the hospital, where I stayed for a few days, under observation. The official explanation was that I had suffered a panic attack, possibly triggered by the stress of being alone for so long. But I knew the truth. The house was sold shortly afterward. I never returned there. Yet to this day, in my darkest nightmares, I see those eyes gleaming in the darkness, and I feel that thing's presence watching me, waiting for the right moment to finish what it started. And deep down, I know that one day, it will find me again. The days following the incident were shrouded in a thick fog of fear and uncertainty. After the police rescued me that night, they searched the area around the house and the lake, but as usual, found nothing but the oppressive silence that always accompanied the presence of that thing. The official report dismissed any real threat, an anxiety attack caused by isolation and stress, they said. But I knew it was much more than a figment of the mind. My family took me far from there, to the home of relatives in another city. Despite the comfort they tried to offer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, stalked. Even miles away, something inside me whispered that the dark presence was still out there, hunting me, waiting for the right moment to reappear. My mind spun constantly, recalling every detail of those cold eyes, the pale hand, the disturbing laughter. One night, while lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, cruel insomnia gnawing at me, I had a dream. Or maybe it was more than a dream. It felt too real to be just a fantasy. In the dream, I was back at the edge of the lake. The water was still, like black glass reflecting the starless sky. I felt paralyzed, rooted to the ground, unable to move, while I watched a figure slowly emerge from the depths. It was the same as before, tall, skeletal, with eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around. But this time, something was different. It didn't come directly at me. Instead, it stopped at the shore and pointed toward the dense forest around the lake. I followed its gaze but saw only darkness between the trees. However, a new, distinct presence seemed to lurk there. I could feel the weight of that entity, as if the very air was being sucked into the forest. Deep down, I knew that what the figure was pointing to was something far worse, older, and more malevolent than anything I had faced before. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. It wasn't just the fear of a common nightmare. It was as if a message had been sent directly to my mind. There was something in that forest, something I hadn't seen before, something connected to what was hunting me. I knew I had to return there somehow. The thought terrified me, but it was impossible to ignore. Every part of me screamed that I should leave it all behind, but my mind, or perhaps fate, was pushing me back to that cursed place. Against all expectations, after days of reflection and relentless nightmares, I decided I had to go back to the house. My family vehemently opposed it, worried about my mental state. My parents even suggested that I see a therapist, someone who could help me overcome the trauma. But I knew no therapist could solve what I was facing. Whatever was in the lake, in the forest, wasn't something that could be dispelled with therapy sessions. It was real, and I had to face it, no matter how insane it seemed. A week later, I returned to the town. The house had already been sold, but the real estate agency allowed me one last visit to collect some belongings. The new buyer didn't know anything about what had happened, only that the house was being sold below market price, and that was enough. Whatever came next would be his responsibility. I just needed one last chance to understand what was happening. The night I returned to the lake was cold, strangely cold for the end of summer. The air seemed to weigh on my shoulders, as if an invisible force was trying to crush me. The trees around the lake were still, like ancient sentinels, silently watching what was about to unfold. The house, now empty, seemed even darker. Every step I took toward the lake echoed like a distant sound, as if I was walking toward something inevitable. When I reached the shore, the water seemed darker than I remembered. The wind blew softly, but the lake remained eerily calm, almost inviting in its stillness. I stood there, staring at the spot where the figure had emerged before. My eyes narrowed, waiting, almost hoping for something to happen. And it did. The water began to move, forming small ripples that slowly spread to the shore. My body tensed, muscles tightening with anticipation. That's when I saw it. The figure began to emerge again, just as before. Slow, inexorable, its eyes fixed on me. But this time, instead of freezing in fear, I felt something different. I was ready. The presence was undeniably strong, but something inside me resisted now. An ancient fear still pulsed through my veins, but there was a flame of determination that hadn't been there before. The figure stopped at the edge of the lake, just watching. It didn't come closer. Its long, thin finger pointed again toward the forest. I followed its gesture with my eyes, and this time, what I saw took my breath away. Among the trees, something was moving. A gigantic shadow, much larger than the figure in the lake, stirred between the trunks. It was as if the very darkness of the forest was alive, snaking through the treetops, expanding and contracting with each pulse of the wind. Whatever was in the forest wasn't just a presence. It was a force, something that had been there long before the house, the lake, perhaps even before humans. Suddenly, everything made sense. The figure in the lake wasn't the real danger. It was a warning. The entity in the forest, the ancient darkness, was what had truly been hunting me. And now, it was all clear. I wasn't the first person to be hunted by it. The guardian of the lake, the disappearances, the inexplicable deaths, they had all been victims of the same thing. A force that inhabited the forest, feeding on the fear and soul of those who ventured too close. I took a step back, feeling the wet ground beneath my feet. The terror gripped me again, but along with it came the certainty that I couldn't stay there. The figure in the lake slowly lowered its hand and, as before, receded into the dark waters, disappearing once again beneath the surface. The message had been clear. The final battle wouldn't be fought there. It was in the forest, waiting. I returned to the car without looking back. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave and never return. But I knew that as long as that presence existed, I would never have peace. I knew that soon, perhaps on another cold, silent night, I would have to come back to face what was in the forest. I knew that the final confrontation was near, and this time, there would be no escape.